I'm Olivia de Havilland. You see me in these pleasant surroundings, safe, secure. But am I really? Are you?
Welcome to episode 15 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the horrors that lurk in the home, with two movies that depict our safest spaces as places of threat, terror, and murder. First up, we have Jaume Ballaguero's Spanish psychological thriller Sleep Tight from 2011. A highly disturbing character study of a malignant building custodian and the lengths to which he will go to achieve true happiness. Then we head over to Romania for Them, from directing duo David Moureau and Xavier Palud, a French co-production from 2006 that predates The Strangers, in its depiction of a young couple terrorised by a home invasion. Both films are nightmarish slices of Euro horror that crank up the tension and dismantle the notion of home being a sanctuary, exploiting the helplessness of their central characters. And despite being made 15 to 20 years ago, both also feed into modern anxieties about isolation, class, power imbalance, and the fragility of what we call society. Along the way, we'll be discussing the origins of home invasion horror, silent movie director Lois Weber, the career of director Jaume Ballaguero, new French extremity cinema, and much, much more. Before we do that though, as always, I'd like to mention the key references that I've used for this week's episode, all of which will be listed in the show notes. For the discussion on Sleep Tight, I've referred to the books Spanish Horror Films by Antonio Lazaro Ribol and The Spanish Fantastic by Sheila Rowan-Legg. I've also referred to interviews with Jaume Ballaguero, Luis Tosar, Marta Etura, and Alberto Marini on the websites diariodevenusville.com, moviemuser.co.uk, milanacine.españa, and 20minutos.españa. I've also referred to video Q&A sessions with Ballaguero from several of the film's premieres, and all of those can be found on YouTube. And for the discussion on Them, I have referred to the book Films of the New French Extremity by Alexandra West, and interviews with David Moureau, Xavier Palud, Olivier Bonamy, and Michael Cohen on the websites ecranlarge.com, devildead.com, and allocine.fr. I've also referred to bonus material, including the making of documentary, that is available on the special Blu-ray edition from Umbrella Entertainment. The subgenre of home invasion horror really exploded in the early 2000s, possibly as a reaction to the cataclysm of 9/11, with the invaded home reflecting the sudden shift in belief about national security and personal safety. But its roots go back much, much further, even to the turn of the last century. In 1897, a man called Oscar Metenier opened a very small theatre in a disused and desanctified chapel in the Pigalle district of Paris. Located at the end of a long, cobbled and dimly lit alleyway in what was then one of the most crime-ridden areas of the city, this would become home to some of the most violent, shocking, and extreme theatre that the world had ever seen. And he called it the Théâtre de Grand Guignol, or, to translate it into English, the Theatre of the Big Puppets. Over the years, it developed a reputation as both a tourist attraction and the inspiration behind much modern horror, with the term Grand Guignol now used widely to describe cinema that theatricalizes shocking imagery and depicts heightened drama and baroque and elaborate mayhem. Theatre of Blood from 1973 and Suspiria from 1977 are both examples of Grand Guignol cinema. But then again, so are films like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane from 1962 and its follow-up, Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, from 1964. I first became aware of the term when I was about 8 years old, and I saw it in a book called Horror Movies, written by a man called Dennis Gifford. This was a seminal book of the 1970s, and was an absolute must-have for any fans of the horror genre. I never had a copy myself, and I was incredibly envious of a school friends edition, something that we would pore over on the school bus, with mouths agape at the lurid movie stills within. And in this book, there was a chapter called How Grand Was My Guignol, in which Mr. Gifford described the origins of the horror movie. However, I was only 8 years old, and I had no idea of the origin or meaning of the term, and I certainly didn't speak any French. In fact, as many listeners will be able to attest, I'm still completely unable to, something that will doubtless become even more apparent as we progress through this week's episode. So for me, it was pronounced Grand Guignol, and it was probably the name of a filmic monster, rather like the creature from the Black Lagoon. Many of these short one-act plays that were performed at the Théâtre de Grand Guignol, or Theatre of the Grand Guignol, which is how I still say it in my head, were written by a playwright called André Delorde. And in 1901, he wrote a play called Au Téléphone, or At the Telephone, which is now probably one of the most famous ones that was performed there. This tells the story of a man who leaves his wife and children to go away on business, only to receive a panic-stricken phone call from his wife telling him that intruders are breaking into their home. And our protagonist is forced to listen helplessly as his wife and children are horribly and brutally murdered. And that's pretty much the end of the play. As I mentioned, the Theatre of the Grand Guignol liked to specialise in shocking material. This play, written nearly 125 years ago, and which uses the, as then relatively new technology of the telephone as a tool for terror, is, as far as I've been able to tell, the earliest example of a home invasion horror story ever written, or at least ever performed. And its influence is with us still. Swap the telephone for a Zoom or Skype call, and you have the basic horror at a distance narrative of movies like Unfriended from 2014. At the Telephone would go on to be filmed in 1909 as The Lonely Villa by D.W. Griffith, a man perhaps best known today for his 1915 movie The Birth of a Nation, and the less said about that for better. But 6 years before all of that, he gave the world its first home invasion horror movie with this 1909 short. Of course, he was making a movie in Hollywood, as opposed to staging nightmares down a Parisian backstreet, so the ending is changed rather drastically, and good wins out. And as if to prove that remakes are not a recent innovation, the story was kind of retold just a few years later, in 1913, by America's first ever female film director, Lois Weber, with her short movie, Suspense. This, in my opinion, is far superior to the Griffith movie, not least for the incredibly innovative cinematography that's on display. In this film, Weber pioneered the use of split-screen photography, as well as including a number of sequences that for the time were incredibly groundbreaking, including overhead close-ups and reflections in car rearview mirrors, all of which is quite staggering really, given the bulky nature of the equipment that she and her team would have been using. She has gone on to be described as one of the most important and prolific film directors in the era of silent movies, and film historians have also said that, along with D.W. Griffith, Weber was the American cinema's first genuine auteur, a filmmaker involved in all aspects of production, and one who utilised the motion picture to put across her own ideas and philosophies. The IMDb credits her as directing 135 films, writing 114, and acting in 100. She was also one of the first directors to experiment with sound, and the first American woman to direct a full-length feature film, which was The Merchant of Venice in 1914. Very interestingly, from my perspective, She was also one of the first directors to come to the attention of the censors in Hollywood's early years, though I'm not exactly sure why. Perhaps more importantly, in 1917, she was also the first American female director to own her own film studio, so groundbreaking doesn't even begin to describe her. Both The Lonely Villa and Suspense are available for you to watch for free on YouTube. To be honest, unless you are a genre completist, you can probably give The Lonely Villa a miss, but Suspense is definitely worth watching for the ahead-of-its-time camera trickery and the way that Webber originated techniques that are still used by many directors today. Moving forward in time, it is in crime drama and film noir that we see the subgenre really start to develop. In 1939, the Columbia Studios movie Blind Alley, based on a successful Broadway play of the same name, featured a psychiatrist and his family being held hostage by an escaped criminal and his gang. During the hostage situation, the psychiatrist analyzes the gang leader, and the film is a highly enjoyable combination of noir crime drama and Freudian dream theory. It's available to watch on YouTube, and despite a couple of creaky performances, it has much to recommend it, not least some rather surprisingly dark moments. This was followed in 1955 by the similarly themed The Desperate Hours, directed by William Wyler and starring Humphrey Bogart. This was based on a play and novel of the same name, both of which were very, very, very loosely inspired by real events. This again tells the story of an escaped criminal gang who take a family hostage while trying to make their escape. Interestingly, the original Broadway production had a young actor called Paul Newman in the role of the main antagonist, but as he wasn't exactly a household name at the time, he was passed over for the movie and the role was aged up and given to Humphrey Bogart. Perhaps even more fascinating, though, is the backstory of the real crime itself. In September 1952, the Hill family of Pennsylvania were indeed held hostage for 19 hours, but were, by their own account, treated courteously and with great respect by the criminals. The criminals were arrested shortly after the event, and the Hills moved away from their home to start a new life and escape all of the publicity. The incident, however, was used as a very loose inspiration by the writer Joseph Hayes when he wrote his novel The Desperate Hours. When the novel was turned into a Broadway play, Life magazine published an article stating that the play was a reenactment of the Hills story, when, in fact, it was a much more violent scenario, which included sexual assault and battery. To make matters worse, Life illustrated it with photos of the actors in the actual home in which the real events had taken place. Incredibly tasteful, as I'm sure you'll agree. Mrs. Hills had a breakdown shortly after publication, and the Hills sued Life magazine, arguing that the article was false and had violated their right to privacy. At the initial trial in New York, a jury sided with the Hills and awarded them damages. Life appealed the decision, but the appeal was overturned, so they then went to the US Supreme Court, invoking the First Amendment. Their argument was that the story was in the public interest and that there had been no malice. At the Supreme Court, the man who argued the case on the side of the Hills was a former politician who had returned to practicing law when his bid to become governor of California had been unsuccessful. And that man's name was Richard Nixon. In 1967, the Supreme Court finally ruled in favor of Life Incorporated, and the Hills lost their case. However, the very public profile of the case and the arguments that Richard Nixon had presented before the Supreme Court went quite some way to improving his public profile, and this, along with various strategies that had been taking shape in the background, helped him stage his political comeback, culminating in his successful run for the US presidency in 1968. And the rest, as they say, is history. Back in the world of cinema, The Desperate Hours, which was critically acclaimed but not a huge financial success, was remade in 1990, starring Anthony Hopkins and a pre-career slump Mickey Rourke. Though, to be honest, it's not a very good movie, in my opinion, and viewers would probably be better off sticking with the class and noir sensibilities of the original. Also released in 1955 and also partially based on a true story is the movie The Night Holds Terror, which combines home invasion with the dangers of picking up hitchhikers, and in which a foolish act of kindness results in a family being held hostage by a gang of criminals. It's also available on YouTube and is definitely worth a watch, if only to see an early appearance by a very young John Cassavetes as the lead gang member. Criminals also invade the home of Olivia de Havilland in Lady in a Cage from 1964, in which she is trapped inside a private elevator after a power failure. This all happens just in time for a drunk passerby to notice her helplessness and invite his friends over, including a young James Caan in his first major movie. Seen as an entry in the hagsploitation subgenre, and nothing if not over the top, it was panned by critics at the time, most of whom wondered what the hell Olivia de Havilland was doing in it. Columnist Hedda Hopper suggested that the film should be burned, and in a rather staggering display of misogyny, Time magazine said that the film, quote, adds Olivia de Havilland to the list of cinema actresses who would apparently rather be freaks than be forgotten. End quote. Charming. In hindsight, though, despite its somewhat theatrical melodrama, the Grand Guignol strikes yet again, it is an interesting depiction of societal fears of the time, with a fair amount to say about class, privilege, and mindless violence. There is also, at one point, a scene in which James Caan is asked what his victims have done to deserve it, to which he responds with the nihilistic response, "They were here." And that's a sentiment that will feel all too familiar to anyone who has watched the 2008 home invasion movie The Strangers. An actress who fared rather better with the critics was Audrey Hepburn, who was Oscar nominated for her role in the 1967 movie Wait Until Dark. Although perhaps more of a taut thriller than a true home invasion movie, it nevertheless features a nail-biting climax between Hepburn, as the blind protagonist, and a frankly terrifying Alan Arkin. If you've never seen it, I highly recommend it, but please ensure that you watch it in absolute pitch darkness to get the full effect. By the 1970s, home invasion cinema was becoming more commonplace, though it tended to form part of the narrative rather than be the central conceit. In 1971, See No Evil, also released as Blind Terror, took more than a little inspiration from Wait Until Dark, and is a film that we discussed back in episode 4, when we spoke about its screenwriter, Brian Clemens. In the same year, Sam Peckinpah directed Dustin Hoffman, Susan George, and Peter Vaughan in Straw Dogs, an incredibly uncomfortable film based on a novel called The Siege of Trench's Farm. I've only seen it once, and to be honest, that was enough for me, but many people have rated it Peckinpah's best work. That being said, others have called it deeply misogynistic and problematic in the way that it depicts sexual assault, so it's really down to the viewer to decide which side of the argument they sit on. It is without doubt a very well-made film. I just don't think it was necessarily made for me. Perhaps inevitably, it was remade in 2011, just as the home invasion peak of the early 2000s reached its climax. This version starred James Marsden and Kate Bosworth, but I haven't seen it, so I cannot comment as to its quality or its relationship to the original. Across the 1970s and the 1980s, we of course saw the rise of both the Italian giallo film and the slasher movie, many of which used home invasion as a plot device. I've decided to not include them in this discussion because we really don't have time, though there probably is an argument that something like Torso from 1973 could easily find a home here due to its last 30 minutes. The same is also probably true of Wes Craven's Last House on the Left from 1972, in which murderous criminals take shelter in the family home of one of their victims. And if we're including that, we should also include its remake from 2009, which again came as part of the millennial spike in the home invasion subgenre. The success of the original Last House on the Left also, of course, gave rise to a number of imitations, most notably from Italy, under the Filone principle that we discussed back in episode 5. These include Night Train Murders from 1975 and The House at the Edge of the Park from 1980, a surprisingly late ripoff, in which David Hess all but repeats his Last House on the Left performance, but with the added sleazy gloss that we have come to expect from Italian exploitation movies of that period. Of course, all of this consumption of violence comes at a price. In 1997, Austrian auteur and provocateur Michael Haneke decided that it was time that horror audiences took a long, hard look at themselves, whilst attempting to profit from them at the same time. This was the release of his film Funny Games, which is full of nudge-nudge fourth wall breaks, and was devised, by his own admission, as a slap in the face to make consumers of violence question their role and consider the impact of their choices on society. It is at once a very well-made film and a beyond patronising have-your-cake-and-eat-it piece of movie-making. And, to be honest, if you're going to lecture me on my consumption of horror, at least have the decency to do so without trying to pick my pocket at the same time. Sadly for Haneke, the film didn't have the reach that he originally wanted, and this led him to direct an English-language remake in 2007, which starred Naomi Watts and Tim Roth. This was an attempt for him to get his message to a much wider global audience. And I hope you all learned your lesson. You naughty, naughty, naughty people. As I mentioned at the top of the show, the subgenre really exploded in the early 2000s, reflecting postmodern anxieties around terrorism, vulnerability, random violence, and the idea that nowhere is safe. In 2002, David Fincher's Panic Room gave us Jodie Foster and a young Kristen Stewart in hiding from Jared Leto, and if you've seen any of his recent movies, you can hardly blame them. Meanwhile, the French gave us High Tension in 2002, Them in 2006, and Inside in 2007, and more on those three a little bit later. We also had the previously mentioned remakes of Funny Games and Last House on the Left, The Strangers, which was released in 2008, and a 2012 home invasion reimagining of the trauma movie Mother's Day, which took the title and very little else. All of which, of course, brings us on to our first movie of the week. Sleep Tight was released in 2011 and was directed by Jaume Ballaguero from a screenplay by Alberto Marini. It stars Luis Tosar, Marta Etura, Alberto San Juan, and Petra Martinez. Jaume Ballaguero was born in 1968 in Catalonia, but was raised in and around Barcelona. He studied communications and photography at university, and while studying, worked as a late-night radio host and a film journalist. In the 1990s, he began creating and publishing fanzines, beginning with Zine Shock in 1991, announcing his artistic intentions with an editorial that stated, quote, "We support obscure and wicked cinema. From the ridiculous to the obscene, from the candid to the outrageous, we are interested in cinema which is peripheral to bourgeois good taste. That is, illegitimate and bizarre cinema." End quote. He produced 5 fanzines between 1991 and 1993, so by the time he started making his first movies, he had already made a name for himself amongst horror fans, and was declared as, quote-unquote, one of us. Working with colleagues from the fanzine, he wrote and directed 2 short movies, Alicia in 1994 and Dias Sin Luz, or Days Without Light, in 1995. Alicia, which was apparently reminiscent of early David Lynch and David Cronenberg, tells the story of a teenage girl who is abducted by insect-like rubber men wearing S&M gear, and is then prepared as a sacrificial offering. Days Without Light, which was described as a cross between Cronenberg and the painter Lucian Freud, told the story of an orphan and his very strange relationship with his foster parents. Both performed exceptionally well on the festival and art house cinema circuit, and Alicia won Best Short Film at the 1994 Stitches International Film Festival. His work on fanzines and the success of these 2 shorts bolstered his reputation, and in 1999 he released his first feature, Los Sin Nombre, or The Nameless, which is based on a novel of the same name by the British author Ramsey Campbell. This tells the story of a mother whose daughter is kidnapped by a strange cult, the Nameless of the title, and her quest to find her. Of the original novel, Ballaguero said, quote, "What really captivated me in Ramsey Campbell's novel, apart from the very terrifying and very original storyline, was the treatment given to evil and perversion, the way that perversity attracts some of the characters in the novel, and the fascination that evil wields over them." End quote. The finished movie is, in my opinion, a little bit disjointed, with a rather slow beginning, suddenly giving way to a final third that feels a little bit too crammed with ideas. But it is nevertheless a very assured debut that has more than a few echoes of David Fincher's Seven, not least in its cinematography and the rather nihilistic themes of cruelty and despair. He followed this in 2002 with an English-language film called Darkness, which was not released in the US or the UK until 2004. Starring Ian Glenn, Lena Olin and Anna Paquin, it is a combination of cult and ghost story, and whilst it was a financial success in both Spain and the US, it was not particularly well received by the critics. I have to say that I really like it, and I'm considering covering it in a future episode in this series, so I won't say anything more about it just now. He followed this with Fragile, an atmospheric ghost story set in a hospital on the south coast of England, which was released in 2005. But it would be his next two movies, which he co-directed with Paco Plaza, that would cement his reputation on the horror stage. And these were the brilliant found footage movies Wreck, which was released in 2007, and its immediate follow-up, Wreck 2, which was released in 2009. These are intense and incredibly atmospheric movies covering a viral breakout in a locked-down Madrid apartment block. And if you've never seen them, then you really are missing out. Found footage for me can be a little bit hit and miss, but when it's done right, it can be absolutely brilliant, and both of these movies do it perfectly. And again, we're going to be covering both of them in a few weeks' time, so I won't say anything further. However, following the high-octane found footage nightmares of those two movies, Ballaguero found himself looking to do something different. For him, Wreck and Wreck 2 were experiments in trying to make a different type of movie than he had previously, and he wanted to return to what he called a more conventional style of filmmaking. And when he saw the screenplay from writer Alberto Marini, he knew it was the perfect choice. It was a thriller built through small, everyday elements that, when manipulated, would allow him to unleash horror on the audience. And here we are getting into the spoiler section, so if you haven't seen the movie yet, it's time to proceed with caution. As I mentioned last week, if you're in the UK, this is a very difficult film to get hold of, but it is available to stream on Shudder in the US, and I believe also in various other territories. So, if you have access to a VPN, you can watch it that way. Sleep Tight is, if I'm honest, not necessarily a home invasion movie in the traditional sense of the term, in that the victim of the invasion has little to no idea that it is actually happening. As a result, there are no panicked moments of realization or desperate attempts to escape that tend to be the staples of the genre. What we have instead is a far more insidious and slow-burn thriller, where the viewer is aware of everything that is happening, while the nominal heroine of the film has no idea whatsoever. The screenplay tells the story of Cesar, a doorman in a quite frankly stunning Barcelona apartment block, who spends his days tormenting the various residents in an effort to make their lives as miserable as possible. The main focus of his attention through the movie is Clara, a young and happy-go-lucky resident who has also had the great misfortune to attract his attention. Sadly for Clara, he also has full access to her apartment and uses this ability to inflict any number of horrors on her, including drugging her with chloroform, lacing her skincare with irritants, infesting the apartment with cockroaches, and much, much worse. The writer, Alberto Marini, is also a producer and director, and had already worked with Ballaguero in his capacity as an executive producer on the Wreck movies. In addition, he also scripted the TV movie To Let, which Ballaguero had directed in 2006 as part of the Spanish anthology TV series Tales to Keep You Awake. The inspiration for the screenplay, which he would later go on to adapt into a novel, came during a trip to New York. At the time, he and his wife were considering moving to Manhattan and were touring apartments with a real estate agent. Although they realised very quickly that they couldn't afford to live there, what struck them was the essential nature of the doorman in the apartment buildings. In Marini's own words, quote, "The doorman is an essential person because he enters your life. You have to like him. He's a life partner who goes hand in hand with the apartment." It reminded me of when I lived in Turin, where the doorman also had the key to our apartment. It wasn't uncommon to come home from school and find him at home delivering a package or running an errand. End quote. And from there, he thought, what if the guy who is so central to your life is crazy? What if he is evil? And so the initial concept for the screenplay was born. He wrote the script on spec, thinking initially that he would direct it himself, although once he finished it, he gave it to some friends that he trusted, including Ballaguero. Ballaguero was very impressed and was initially going to be the executive producer, but later offered to take on directing duties himself. Marini thought to himself that no one would be better directing it than his friend, and so the two swapped places. For Ballaguero, the main point of interest was that, although the story of a monstrous character tormenting an innocent girl had been told a million times, this story told it from the perspective of the monster. It basically forces the viewer to identify with César and his plans and strategies. He was particularly interested in setting up a moral conflict within the audience, and in this I think he is incredibly successful, far more so, in my opinion, than Michael Haneke's nudge-nudge, wink-wink approach that I mentioned earlier. In this film, we are, as the viewer, entirely complicit with the villain, forced to observe silently as he creeps out from under her bed, injects her face and body lotions with caustic ingredients, and infects her apartment with cockroaches. Not that this is where we think the film is heading when it first begins. Themes of loneliness and isolation are laid out from the very start, as we hear the voices of callers to a radio helpline show. And then we are immediately introduced to César, our very strange protagonist. He tells us in voiceover that he can never be happy, and in fact, never has been. We see him balancing on a ledge at the top of the apartment building and believe that he is about to end his life. And little do we know that in fact it would probably be better for everybody else in the movie were he to follow through and just jump off. After the tone is set, Ballaguero tricks us with a false mise-en-scène. We see César waking up next to somebody that we presume is a girlfriend or lover. He gets dressed and creeps from the room, and we assume he is leaving for work, and that he just doesn't want to wake her up. We are, admittedly, a little confused to then see him enter his own apartment in the basement of the building, but we are still not at this point particularly suspicious. Perhaps he and the woman, who we later find out is called Clara, are having an affair that has to remain secret, and this is why he needs to creep out in the early hours of the morning. Even the initial interaction between Clara and César as she leaves the building could be mistaken for that of two secret lovers, and were we not aware of the genre of the movie, this is most likely what we would believe. It is only much later, when we see him hiding underneath her bed, that we realise that we have been tricked, and that something very, very dark is happening while Clara is sleeping. In an interview with a Spanish publication at the time of the film's release, Ballaguero explains that the film is a game, one with 3 players, César, Clara, and the viewer. Across the course of the game, César gradually reveals his cards, and the viewer starts to discover what is happening in the plot, wondering how far he will go, and also what their own reaction is going to be. Of course, this approach will only be successful with the right actor in the role, and Ballaguero struck gold with Luis Tosar. Born in 1971 in Galicia, Spain, Tosar is one of the most respected and versatile Spanish actors of his generation. He originally trained in music and briefly studied history before beginning his career on stage and television in the 1990s. His early breakthrough came with a TV series called Spring Tides, which opened the door to national recognition. His film career really started to gain momentum in the early 2000s with a Goya award-winning role in the film Mondays in the Sun in 2002, in which he co-starred with Xavier Bardem. He then went on to win another Goya for his portrayal of an abusive husband in the 2003 movie I Give You My Eyes. An intense and incredibly magnetic performer, he has worked in both Spanish and international productions, and he says he was attracted to playing the character of César because of the perversity of the central idea and the evil side of the character, saying, quote, "The fact that he's very twisted was part of the attraction for me. It was really like the evil side of things and taking the audience along for the ride. And for me as an actor, that was part of the fun. It felt like a big prank." End quote. As César, the actor gives an incredibly intense and magnetic performance, though, to be fair, I've never seen him give anything less than that. It is, however, a characterization that has a surprising amount of depth and complexity, and it is this depth of character which causes quite a bit of conflict for the audience, not least in the scene where he has accidentally chloroformed himself and is trying to escape from the apartment without getting caught. We should, of course, want him to be caught, and for his activities to be brought into the light, but part of us also hopes that he will somehow get away. In this respect, it is similar to the home invasion sequence in George A. Romero's Martin, that we discussed a few weeks ago. This scene is immediately followed by a brief but mesmerizing sequence of adrenaline release when he makes his way down in the lift, and the physicality that he displays in both of these scenes is really nothing short of spellbinding. Both the actor and the director have been at pains to say that César is not a psychopath, or at least not in the way that most movies would portray. And whilst César may commit a murder in the movie, Ballaguero has been at pains to stress that it is completely accidental, and it's also an act from which he gains no satisfaction, at least not until he sees the emotional aftermath that is visited on Clara. In an interview when the film premiered, César elaborated, saying, "I don't think César is a psychopath. I think he's a guy who has an existential problem, like thousands of people might have, or like all of humanity might have. Everyone wants to be happy, and everyone wants to do better in life, and everyone tries to achieve it however they can. Some tend towards good, and others tend a little bit more towards evil. And César is a guy who has decided to lean directly towards evil." César's motivations and dysfunctions are summed up in one of his many monologues, or more accurately, confessions, wherein he explains that he cannot be happy and believes that he was born without that capacity, like being blind or deaf. Essentially, César is a parasite who feeds off misery, and when he encounters somebody who is profoundly positive, which of course describes Clara, he goes out of his way to make sure that that stops. His personal satisfaction comes from others being miserable, and nowhere is this more clearly shown than in the spectacular cruelty of his interaction with Miss Veronica, an initially somewhat comedic character played by Petra Martinez. She is introduced as something of a caricature, an overly familiar figure with two small dogs. She in fact seems more like a character in a sitcom than we would find in a conventional thriller. It is, however, through her that we first glimpse César's real character, when he deliberately misfeeds her dog, knowing that it will end up shitting all over her apartment. But nothing can really prepare us for the sheer psychological torture that he inflicts on her later in the movie, ironically enough, when she is trying to be kind to him after he has been fired from his job. As she offers him a Tupperware box of homemade stew, he turns to her and says, quote, "You're very good, Miss Veronica. I don't understand why you're single. No kids and no partner, and it'll just get harder. You're old, and you'll get older. It's a shame you have to waste away in that apartment. Because the dogs help, of course, but we know they aren't children. Just mutts. Let's not kid ourselves. Because I see. I spend hours here. The neighbours talk. They pretend to listen to you. But it's pity. Really, they couldn't care less. So don't trust them. Believe me. You're past it and terribly alone. And believe me, there's no remedy for that. End quote. The way in which she slowly crumbles and returns to her apartment is heartbreaking. We can see from the very brief interaction with Clara as she retreats into the elevator that she will never trust again, and that the wound César has inflicted is probably mortal. It is a masterful performance from Martinez, who is a multi-award-winning actress whose career spans more than 6 decades. Miss Veronica is not the only apartment dweller with whom César has an uncomfortable interaction. There is also the character of Ursula, the young girl who truly sees him for who he is, and who, despite only being a child, holds a significant amount of leverage over him, blackmailing him at first for money, and then for pornography. And it is this dynamic that underlines the fact that he is not a typical psychopath, as somebody who was would clearly have disposed of her long ago, or at the very least do so at the climax of the movie, where she is certainly terrorised, but ultimately released. Ballaguero himself was particularly fascinated by Ursula as she appeared on the page, causing him to question the nature of her personality and ask himself, who the hell is this young girl who can stand up to a man like César? I think her character can be treated very much in 2 ways. She could be a typical preteen, and I think if we're honest, most of us in our own childhoods have probably experienced to some degree how truly awful many preteen girls can be. So in that respect, she could just be a very bratty child with far too lenient parents, who is chancing her luck and seeing how far she can push things, testing the boundaries before she enters adolescence. Her shock and doubtful hesitation when César gives her the adult movie she has asked for would indicate that this is most likely the case, as to be fair does her outright terror when he comes to visit her towards the end of the film. There is, however, another possibility, and that is that she and César are kindred spirits, and that she is in fact a little monster in the making. This is something that certainly occurred to Louis Tosar, as he explained in an interview that he always saw Ursula as a replacement, and that perhaps when César is out of the game, she would take over his role in the apartment. I have to say, I feel incredibly sorry for Miss Veronica, if that were indeed to be the case. But of course the real relationship is the one between César and Clara, which is frankly rather a one-way relationship, as Clara has no idea of César's activities. To her, he is just the doorman, someone with whom she exchanges pleasantries every morning, and who helps her with bug infestations or unblocks her drains. Clara is played by Marta Etura, who has described her character as being cheerful and optimistic. Everything is going well for her, at least as far as she is aware. She has a creative job and is in love with her partner. She is the absolute antithesis of César, and that, of course, is what makes her a target. The actress has said she was allowed a great deal of freedom to bring her own creativity to the character, and this is something we see in the moments that she is alone, or supposedly alone, in her apartment. With very little dialogue in the film, what we learn of her character we learn through observation, much in the way that she is observed by César, and we become voyeurs to the intimate moments of her life. The scene where she dances around the room to loud music while César is hiding under the bed was a tourist suggestion and was not in the original screenplay. She went on to say, quote, "I wanted to do this scene because I found it interesting and because it somehow reinforced that this violation of her privacy was even more underlined." End quote. What is particularly awful, in a way, about her situation is that, apart from the letters and text messages, She actually has no idea at all of what is happening and feels she is just having a run of extremely bad luck. When we see the montage of her slowly losing energy as a result of the constant chloroforming, or hiding her eyes as she doesn't want to see how bad her rash has become, we, as the viewer, are all too aware that she is the victim of repeated violation, while she has no idea that anything untoward is happening. And this makes us, as the viewer, even more complicit in his scheming. When all is finally and brutally revealed to her at the end of the film, it is a truly devastating moment, and one from which we doubt that she can ever recover. The final relationship that I want to discuss is the one that he has with his mother, or at least we assume that she is his mother. Given the incredibly sadistic nature of the character's interpersonal transactions, she could in fact quite easily be somebody unrelated that he has decided to torture. Either way, she is as much a victim of his bizarre pathology as Clara and Miss Veronica, if not more so, because he makes her fully aware of his plans and intentions, and she is powerless to do anything about them. There were originally ideas of expanding the relationship between the two, but these were not put into practice. And as it is, these scenes have a quiet and tragic menace about them. She is clearly both terrified and saddened by the things that he tells her, even if she can barely respond, save looking away. For a man who began his career with fanzines that celebrated extreme gore movies and violence, in practice, Ballaguero's movies tend to favour suggestion and dark psychology over explicit gore, and this is certainly true of Sleep Tight. This is a film where the discomfort comes from the mind games that César plays with his victims, and the intentional cruelty that he inflicts throughout the narrative, including getting the cleaner fired from her job and her son arrested. The violence, when it comes, is, as I mentioned earlier, accidental, but there is a horrific realism in the way that Marcos slowly bleeds out, the light in his eyes slowly fading, and a look of helpless realization on his face. It may be a very brief moment, but its impact is far greater and hits far harder than many other horror movie sequences that often fall into the realm of the cartoonish. The one criticism that I have with this movie, and it is admittedly a very slight one, is the final song used to play out over the end credits. While the film has judiciously used ironic pop music to undercut the malice, I feel that the brutal and frankly gut-punching final sequence is let down somewhat by the continuation of this approach and the use of the Burt Bacharach song Keep Me in Mind as the final credits roll. Personally, I would rather that the film had played out with more of the superb orchestral and electronic score from Lucas Vidal. This had played to great effect across much of the picture, and it's a score for which the composer was deservedly nominated for a Jerry Goldsmith Award in 2011. But, like I say, it is a very small gripe though. When it was released in 2011, Sleep Tight was met with mostly positive reviews from critics. Many praised it as a tense and unsettling thriller, with several highlighting the skill of the director in building slow burn suspense. Variety described it as a film designed to give audiences sleepless nights, and Empire admired its Hitchcock-like style and atmosphere. Reviewers also singled out Louis Tozar's performance, calling him chilling and compelling, and overall, the critical consensus was that it was an effective psychological horror that lingers long after viewing. However, not everyone was positive, and here's something that won't come as any surprise to regular listeners of the show. The New York Times was less than complimentary. Although they stated that the film worked initially, they went on to say that Ballaguero, quote, is so overtaken by his villain that he becomes like César, displaying an eagerness to play the role of tormentor, which kills both the movie's pleasure and its flickering political subtext. End quote. Well, what a shocker. But perhaps we should really just let all of the awards do the talking. At the 2012 Gaudi Awards, Sleep Tight was a major winner, taking home 6 prizes, including Best Director, Best Actor, and Best Screenplay, alongside awards for editing and sound. It also won Best Screenplay at the Fantasia Film Festival, the Silver Hugo in the After Dark competition at the Chicago International Film Festival, and it also earned Petra Martinez a Spanish Actors Union Award for Best Actress in a Minor Role. And very well deserved, that one was too. Beyond these wins, the film collected a wide range of nominations. Tazar was nominated for Best Actor at both the Goya Awards and the 4K Awards, while the Gaudi Awards also recognised Marta Etura and several other categories such as cinematography, score and effects. In total, the film's mix of festival success and national industry recognition confirmed its place as one of the standout thrillers of the early 2010s, and it's one that still very much holds up today. All of which brings us to our second film of the week. Them was written and directed by Xavier Palud and David Moureau. It was released in 2006 and stars Olivier Bonamy and Michael Cohen. This film has often been categorized as part of the so-called New French Extremity movement of the late 1990s and early 2000s. And this is a rather loose grouping of films that encompasses everything from art house to horror. The term was first coined by a Canadian film critic called James Quand in an essay he published in the magazine Art Forum in February 2004, and it was not necessarily used in the most complimentary manner. In this essay, which was called Flesh and Blood, Sex and Violence in Recent French Cinema, Quand used the term incredibly pejoratively to describe what he saw as a wave of French filmmakers indulging in excessive cinema, mixing graphic sex and violence and bodily trauma with art house pretensions. And this did not just include the horror genre. He also cited films by the director Catherine Breillat and, perhaps not that surprisingly, Gaspar Noé's Irreversible from 2002. In the essay, he wrote that French cinema was, quote, suddenly determined to break every taboo, to wade in rivers of viscera and spumes of sperm, to fill each frame with flesh, nubile or gnarled, and to subject it to all manner of penetration, mutilation, and defilement. End quote. As you can imagine, this was not a term that was necessarily embraced by the filmmakers themselves. However, it seemed to stick, and it became shorthand for any number of European movies that depicted extreme sex and violence, whether they were indeed actually French or not. These include the films Baisse-moi from 2000, and Trouble Every Day from 2001, High Tension from 2003, Calvaire from 2004, Frontières and Inside from 2007, and perhaps most notorious of them all, Martyrs from 2008. Like all waves, the New French Extremity movement peaked and then crashed, and the last movie of the cycle is generally thought to be Livid from 2011. This was directed by Julien Maury and Alexandre Bustillo, and that's a film that we are actually discussing next week. Within this grouping, though, there are several home invasion movies, most notably High Tension and Inside, though one could also argue that Martyrs, at the very least, begins with a home invasion before it morphs into something much different and far more unpleasant. Inside, from 2007, was from the same directing duo as Livid, so I will save that discussion for next week. But I do think it's worth taking a very slight pause to mention the movie High Tension, and not least its relationship with the home invasion novel Intensity, written by the best-selling American author Dean Koontz. In 1995, Koontz published his novel Intensity, which follows a young woman who is visiting a friend's house when a serial killer breaks in and murders the family. Initially hiding in the house as the killer moves from room to room, searching for survivors, she eventually stows away in his motorhome, hoping to save a kidnapped girl that he has imprisoned. On the journey, the killer stops at a remote gas station, and the heroine secretly tries to alert people to the danger. Koontz has often cited it as one of his most tightly constructed thrillers, and the narrative is marked by relentless pacing, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the title of the book. It was adapted into a fairly faithful TV miniseries in 1997, starring John C. McGinley and Molly Parker, and this was broadcast widely, especially on cable, and also, very importantly, international syndication. In 2003, Alexandre Ayer released his movie, High Tension, which begins with two female friends, Marie and Alex, heading to Alex's family home in the countryside. That night, a serial killer breaks in and murders the family, while Marie hides in the house as the killer moves from room to room searching for survivors. The killer kidnaps Alex and drives her into the night with Marie in hot pursuit. They then end up at a deserted gas station where Marie tries to secretly alert the attendant to the danger. At this point, any narrative similarities between the two go their separate ways, and some might also say that any suspension of disbelief when watching High Tension also goes out of the window, but that's my personal opinion. Nevertheless, many critics and viewers immediately noticed the resemblance between Intensity and the very similarly titled High Tension, and accusations of plagiarism soon filled the air. Dean Koontz himself publicly acknowledged the similarities but chose not to sue, reportedly believing that a lawsuit would only draw more attention to the French film, and which, according to his website, he considered, quote, so puerile, so disgusting, and so intellectually bankrupt that he didn't want the association with it that would inevitably come if he pursued an action against the filmmakers. End quote. Ayer himself has rarely spoken about the controversy, though at the Sundance Film Festival in 2004, he reportedly acknowledged that he had read Intensity and was aware of the parallels between his film and the novel. At the same time, though, he referred to his movie as a tribute to all horror films, so kind of sidestepped any direct commentary on the similarity between the two. To be honest, at the time, all of this very much passed me by, and I really wasn't aware of the Dean Koontz work until long after I had seen High Tension, and I happened to catch the miniseries on cable TV late at night in the UK. And while the two narratives do admittedly diverge at the midway point, the similarities are, in my opinion, very much in your face and very hard to miss. Which is a shame because, given the incredibly contrived twist at the end of High Tension, the acting and the first half of the film were, to my mind, the only things it had going for it. That being said, though, I do, of course, own a copy of it on Blu-ray Special Edition, so I guess I can't dislike it all that much. In amongst all of this blood and thunder, the film Them sits rather uncomfortably, as it is a rather restrained film in terms of violence. And I think its categorization as part of the new French extremity movement does it somewhat of a disservice. What it is, in my opinion, is a lean and taut thriller that wrings a great deal of tension out of a very simple premise. A young French couple, Clémentine, a French teacher, and Lucas, a novelist, are renovating a very large and very isolated home in Romania when a group of unknown assailants arrive at their house in the dead of night and begin to torment them. At first sight, this, of course, seems very similar to the plotline of The Strangers, which was released 2 years later, in 2008. And since the release of that film, there has been a fair amount of online debate as to whether The Strangers is an unofficial remake, or even worse, a rip-off, and inevitably, of course, which of the two is the better movie. Although The Strangers did go into production 4 months after the US release of the French movie, it is not a remake or indeed a rip-off of the earlier film. As we discussed at the beginning of the episode, home invasion was very much in the zeitgeist in the early 2000s, and the screenplay for The Strangers had already been written as early as 2004, so it's hardly the same thing as the Intensity and High Tension debacle. It's just one of those movie-making coincidences that we see from time to time. As to which movie is better, well, I think that's very much down to your personal preference, and also probably which one you saw first. The two are very different in tone and style, with The Strangers very much inspired by the Manson murders, as well as a series of break-ins that occurred in the screenwriter's neighbourhood when he was a child. And it also leans more heavily into the American slasher subgenre, with its masked killers slipping their way into horror iconography. Personally, I prefer the French film, as it leans more into my taste and style preferences. But that's not to say that The Strangers is a bad movie. I just like this one a little bit more. And now we are getting into the spoiler section, and as I mentioned last week, this is not currently available on streaming in the UK, but you can find it on Shudder in the US and in other regions. The directors of this movie, Xavier Palud and David Moureau, met working on advertising productions. Both had studied at film school, but preferred a more hands-on approach to developing their skills, so they took on internships and worked as runners and gophers on film sets to gain real experience. Although they have said they didn't particularly like each other when they first met, an evening with mutual friends listening to film soundtracks made them realise that they liked the same cinema, and it was from this common bond that they developed a friendship and ultimately a working partnership. They started to show each other their respective scripts and short film ideas and realised that each had a different and helpful perspective on the other's work. Although both had ideas that they were trying independently to get off the ground, they also soon realised they could probably do a lot better if they joined forces. They decided to write a film that wouldn't cost much and could be self-produced, and the aim was to create a story that would interest viewers and give it a shot at actually being made into a real film. They quickly realised that this naturally sounded like a genre movie, and more specifically, it sounded like a horror film. They then asked their friends what things scared them, and nearly all responded that it was the idea of someone breaking into their home, which is a fairly understandable response. This then formed the basis for the movie, and also the decision to stay with the protagonist throughout, with the intruders themselves remaining hidden. And in this respect, them is the exact opposite of Sleep Tight, as the viewer has a shared experience with the victims and only knows the information that the victims themselves obtain as they go through the movie. The first draft of the screenplay was written in 3 months, with the two swapping pages with each other as the writing progressed, trying to scare each other with what they each came up with. And this approach, with each writer trying to shock or scare the other, led to a very effective final product, with both saying that they wanted to create the same sense of fear in the audience that they created with each other. The draft then took a further 3 months to refine, and the two started to send it to producers to test its strength and, importantly, its marketability. Out of the 5 producers contacted, 3 responded, one of them being a man called Richard Grandpierre, who had already produced the films Brotherhood of the Wolf in 2001 and Irreversible in 2002. He would also go on to produce Martyrs and Gaspar Noé's Climax in 2016, and so signing with him for a debut movie was really no small achievement. And at this point, I think it's probably worth discussing the quote-unquote based on a true story aspect, which is, if I'm honest, something that has dogged many a modern horror movie, especially since the turn of the millennium. It is true that whilst working in the Czech Republic on an ad campaign, the writers were told a story by a taxicab driver about an incident that had happened to an Austrian couple living in the region. However, the details are sketchy at best, so I think that we can probably say that this film was inspired by a conversation with a taxi driver and leave it at that. Personally, I am rather tired of the whole based on a true story trope, and it's something that I could very much live without. I certainly don't need it to make a film any scarier. That being said, there is some historical context to the movie that I think is worth discussing. The choice to set the movie in Romania is an interesting one, not least because of the troubled history of the country. Between the years of 1965 to 1989, Romania was under the control of the authoritarian regime of Nicolae Ceausescu, a period that was marked by economic mismanagement, dictatorial control, and social engineering. Determined to expand Romania's population, in 1966 Ceausescu introduced a law known as Decree 770, which banned abortion and contraception for most women. This, combined with declining living standards, economic problems, food shortages, and heavy state surveillance, resulted in widespread poverty and the institutionalization of thousands of children whose families could not afford to raise them. Many of these children were placed in vast networks of underfunded and state-run orphanages, and by 1989 there were an estimated 100 to 170,000 children who were institutionalized. Though, if you count abandoned children as well as orphans, some estimates suggest that it was closer to 500,000. After Ceausescu was violently overthrown in December 1989, the country entered a period of upheaval that brought the plight of these children to international attention. Many children either escaped or were turned out of orphanages and found themselves on the streets, especially in Bucharest. At the same time, international journalists and aid workers started to uncover the appalling neglect that was happening inside many of the orphanages, particularly those housing disabled children. Reports suggest that more than 15,000 children died in state institutions from 1967 to 1990, mainly due to neglect and abuse. There was outrage at these revelations from the international community, and that led to reform, with Romania reducing the number of children in large residential care and shifting to family-based and community protection models. Many such children were depicted in a 2001 documentary called Children Underground, which followed groups of orphans aged between 8 and 16 who lived in subway stations and who survived by scavenging and inhaling solvents to cope with abandonment, trauma, hunger, pain, and despair. It is, of course, highly likely that the writers of this movie were aware of this, and it is therefore no stretch at all to imagine that the children revealed at the end of the movie, inhaling solvents from a bag in the sewer, are products of the former regime and its regressive and barbaric policies towards sexual health and reproductive rights. In this society, Clementine and Lucas are the perennial outsiders, a couple who have moved to Romania and who have capitalized on the power of the euro to buy themselves an obnoxiously large house. They are critical of the country that they have moved to, and they've made no effort at all to learn the language or even fit in. As outsiders to the country, they are as much the them of the title as the children that are tormenting them. Of course, this is not to say that they deserve the torment that they are put through over the course of the very brief runtime, but given the historical context of the country and the gentrification that the couple represent, it is not too difficult to see why they were singled out. When it came to casting, Michael Cohen was a very early choice to play the part of Lucas, a decision driven by the fact that they wanted somebody who would seem natural in the situations that he was being placed in and who represented everyday modern man. As Moureau himself explained, quote, "I never did my military service, and I have nothing of what made a man 50 years ago. If you put me in a house with a girl, if there's a noise, I freak out." End quote. But while Cohen was an early choice, finding the right performer to play Clementine proved a longer process, with over 30 actresses tested for the role. When Bonamy tested, the chemistry between she and Cohen was exactly what was needed, possibly exacerbated by the fact that the two were already friends, and so there was a natural intimacy between them. As a testament to the writing process that I just explained, both of them were scared by the script. Cohen said that it appealed to childish, primal, almost animal fears, and Bonamy said that she knew the film was going to work when she had to stop reading the script late at night. They were also attracted to the challenge of the situations and the tensions that the characters would be going through. They both give incredibly raw performances, and it's also worth noting that the shoot certainly had an impact on Bonamy, who has been reported as saying afterwards that following filming she developed sleep issues and became hypervigilant, saying that she felt as if she needed to watch over everything. This was doubtless not helped by the fact that she suffers from vertigo, and if you've seen the movie, you will know there are parts of the film that would certainly have triggered this during shooting. Another challenge for the actors is that once things get underway, there is essentially very little in the way of dialogue. This is a film that is all about physicality and emotional response. And full confession time now, In 2006, I was so keen to see this film, of which I had heard many great things, that I didn't necessarily go the most legal route in the world in order to watch it. And as a result, I saw a version that had absolutely no English subtitling. And as we all know by now, I cannot speak a word of French, and so had absolutely no idea what anybody was saying. But I have to say, it didn't ruin my enjoyment of the movie at all. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it actually heightened the tension. And I think that this goes to show how effectively the film is directed and how well it is acted, because this is a movie that really is a case of show and don't tell. I really didn't need any dialogue to explain to me the basic narrative of what was happening. And in a world of exposition-heavy cinema, where studios seem to feel that every single thing has to be spelled out for the viewer, I found that to be incredibly refreshing. The minimalist approach to dialogue was not in the original screenplay and came about through the rehearsal process, as both the directors and actors realised that when you are going through such a strong, emotional and terrifying experience, people tend to not say very much. As Cohen himself said, quote, "When you go through this, you don't discuss it, you live it, you're reactive, and as you go through these different states, you very rarely have dialogue or comment on the situation." End quote. As a result, lines of dialogue were cut altogether, or reduced to a word or a short sentence, and this really adds to the realism of the situation on the screen. Also adding to the sense of reality is the fact that the film appears to be shot in real time, even though there are, of course, a few cheats here and there. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point that after this film, the director David Moureau went on to direct the one-take horror movie Mads, which wowed Shudder viewers at the end of last year, and which builds on the frantic intensity that he created in this movie. And if you haven't seen that film yet, I highly recommend that you do. To achieve this real-time approach, the location and set was all important, as it needed to reflect the precision that had been laid out in the script. Shooting took place mainly in a large house near Bucharest, Romania, over a 5-week period, with other locations, such as the elaborate sewer system used for the climax, also nearby. Visually, the film is incredibly striking, particularly given that it was shot on digital in the early 2000s, and the handheld camera work and lighting effects combine to add to the tension and build in this increasingly frantic need to escape. This is particularly true of my favourite sequence in the movie, where Clementine tries to find a way out by escaping through the attic, which is shrouded in plastic, behind which a menacing figure waits in silence. It is an incredibly well-styled moment, and one that lingers in the memory long after the end credits roll. A special mention too must also go to the sound design, which builds menace through the amplification of environmental sounds, like the sudden falling of rain against a car window, or the exaggeration of whispers, creaks, and footsteps. And the score, composed by René Marc Bini, skillfully combines orchestral menace with discordant electronica and musique concrète, rattling the nerves while also being used strategically to allow for disorientating periods of silence. On its release in 2006, the movie received generally positive reviews, which praised its ability to evoke sustained tension and atmosphere while using minimal gore. Its cinematography and effective use of sound were frequently highlighted, and I hope you're sitting down for this, even the New York Times was positive. Though, that being said, they did spend an inordinate amount of time suggesting that the film would have worked better had it played up to the idea that the threat was somehow all in Clementine and Lucas's imagination, which, to be quite honest, I find incredibly baffling. Personally, I feel that this is one of the better entries in the home invasion subgenre. It is a lean and taut thriller with outstanding performances, cinematography, and sound design, and it's a movie that takes you on a roller coaster ride from start to finish. And at just 74 minutes running time, unlike its, frankly, terrifying children, it doesn't outstay its welcome. sleep tight, and then offer two sides of the home invasion coin, with viewers of the first acting as accomplices to the crimes of its protagonist, and viewers of the second acting as witness to the terrors of its central characters. Both are also movies that are incredibly high in tension, while being relatively restrained in gore, relying instead on the strength of the performances and screenplays to create their impact. Both movies reflect societal fears about safety, isolation, and the dangers posed by other people, and strip away our sense of security. And both movies also circle back to the same unnerving truth, that the place we think of as a sanctuary and a shelter is never really beyond intrusion. And that's a thought that's worth holding on to the next time you lock the door and settle down for the night. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode. And I know last week I said I was going to try to make this one shorter, but it looks like I haven't managed it yet again. Oh well, there's always hope for next week. Though, given what we're talking about, that's also highly unlikely. Before we get to that though, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do take a moment to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have any thoughts or comments on any of the films we've discussed so far in the series, please also contact me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com. And you can also follow our Instagram, The Horror Double Bill, for photos, trailers, and more information. By the time this episode comes out, I will be at Fright Fest in central London for 4 and a bit days of back-to-back horror movies. So if any of you are there, I hope you're having as good a time as I probably am. Next week, we are exploring the horrors of ballet school and also discussing one of my favourite films of all time. First up, we have Livid from 2011, from directors Julien Maury and Alexandre Bustillo, starring Chloé Collard, Félix Motti, and Catherine Jacot. Then we head back to 1977 and one of the most influential horror movies ever made, Suspiria, from director Dario Argento, starring Jessica Harper, Stefania Cassini, and the great Joan Bennett. So, if you want to watch ahead and are in the UK, you can watch Livid on Apple TV and the Studio Canal Presents app and channel. And you can watch Suspiria on Amazon Prime, the BFI Player, Apple TV, and for free, although admittedly with ads, on Tubi. So, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and in the meantime, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.